there's one book that's very affected by music, which is The Ground Beneath Her Feet, which is a novel about musicians. And I invented an imaginary rock and roll band, which of course came from India, like all great things. And it was partly inspired by the fact that the thing that I think even now many people don't know is that Freddie Mercury was originally of Indian origin. You know, that his real name was Farrokh Balsara. And he changed it because he didn't want to be ghettoized into world music. You know, so he never really talked about having, but he grew up down the street from me actually. So
that's a little Golden House-like.
Yeah, but it just gave me permission to imagine an Indian music star, you know, who could have been as a superstar, because there at least has been one who was, you know. So so I mean, look, I am a child of the '60s, you know. So that's my music, and of course that means the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. But I was always a little alternative, you know. So I liked the Velvet Underground and Captain Beefheart, and those kind of people. The Love Forever Changes album. You know, Jefferson Airplane, all that. So, and I mean, I suppose the Velvet Underground was a very big thing for me at that time, and then I ended up amazingly getting to know Lou Reed, and that felt like, and it kind of felt like having a kind of divinity's unlisted cell phone number. And the thing about Lou is that when he was a kind of difficult bastard, but when he decided he liked you, he became, I was saying the other day, he became like your Jewish aunt. You know, he would call you all the time. He said, you didn't call this week. Is something the matter? Etc. I thought, really, Lou Reed? But anyway, so yeah, that it has been important, and particularly in that book. And then I had this very strange experience when in the novel The Ground Beneath Her Feet, there's an imaginary songwriter, and I thought, well, at some point I have to take a deep breath and write the imaginary lyrics, you know, because otherwise so dotted through the novel there are fragments or sometimes more extended pieces of imaginary songs, right? And when I finished writing the book, I wanted to make sure that I hadn't made a series of foolish mistakes. So I showed it to friends I have who are in the music business, and including, I mean, I'm, for long, complicated reasons, friendly with U2, and I sent the manuscript to Bono and to the manager of U2, Paul McGuinness, and I said, just tell me where all the mistakes are, you know, so that I can fix it, so it's not embarrassing when the book comes out. And instead what happened is that in The Ground Beneath Her Feet, there's an imaginary song called The Ground Beneath Her Feet, and the lyric of it. And Bono called me and said, you know, in your novel, the title track. And I said, I didn't think novels had title tracks, but he said, anyway, I've written a melody and I think it's very good. And then he wanted to play it to me, but I wasn't in Dublin and he wouldn't say it, so I had to go to Dublin for him to play me this song he'd written. And he was so nervous about it that he wouldn't even play it in front of the other members of the band. So I had to go and sit in his car and for him to play this demo CD that he'd made. And I mean, it's true that the sound system in Bono's car is not like the sound system in your car. If you open the trunk, it's all sound system. You know. So he made me listen to it 3 times before I said anything, and then I liked it a lot, and then then we played it at the band, and then they decided to record it, and then they did record it, and then they played it on their, which tour was it? Elevation, that tour, the All That You Can't Leave Behind album. And so I wrote a U2 song.
Are you still getting royalties from that?
Yes.
What
yes.
did the song
Because
be?
the song is called the Ground Beneath Her Feet. There's even, if you want to go on YouTube, there's a music video directed by Wim Wenders with them and Mila Jovovich and me. And so yeah, that's my one little claim to rock and roll fame.
Star songwriters.
Yeah. No, I have some other. You want,
Boy, I was like,
no, if you want me to go on that, there's more. There's more. Because like for 5 minutes after people heard that you two and I had collaborated on a song, it suddenly became like I became the cool guy that people wanted to, you know. So I got approached by Blur, who still existed then. And anyway, Damon Albarn, who I'd met, we had a friend in common, and he said we should do something, and I said okay, you know. and so he said you should go and meet Alex James, and you know you guys should talk about it. So I agreed to meet Alex James and in a bar, and when I got there, he had prepared for the meeting by drinking a bottle of absinthe. so he was you know, and he said, I got this great idea. Yeah, he said, fucking great idea. He said, I'll write the words, you write the music. And I said, you know, Alex, I don't play a musical instrument, etc. And he said, no, I'll teach you the guitar. I'll teach you in 20 minutes, nothing to it. and then, you know, you write music, it'll be fantastic. So anyway, that didn't happen. So I have, there has been some music in the background of all this. But that's the one novel in which it's very extendedly about rock and roll. Because one of the things I thought was that it was, back then in the 50s and 60s, it was really the first global cultural phenomenon. And it happened at a time when there were no global mass media. You know, so it was actually much, much harder for something to spread across the world. Now everybody knows everything in 10 seconds, you know, but then, I mean, how was it that this happened? And yet it happened all over the world, you know. I mean, I remember meeting a Chinese writer about my age who said that when he was growing up in Beijing, every so often on the radio, they would play grand opera, you know, and he said none of us could understand it at all. And then they would play rock and roll and we all got it right away, you know, so it's something about that. You know, I thought that's really interesting. This is the first global cultural phenomenon, you know, and I wanted to, anyway, so I wrote about it, yeah. I mean, I grew up as a teenager. I was addicted to science fiction, you know, and read it obsessively, and not just the, you know, there's obviously the big famous names like Ray Bradbury and Arthur C. Clarke and Kurt Vonnegut and so on, but I was reading the hardcore. Maybe I don't know if you have in the library. So these old science fiction. There was a magazine called Astounding. That was its name. There's another magazine called Amazing, and those were the real hardcore magazines. And I used to read all of those. And the thing that I found, and this may be what I would say, is that science fiction. Actually, Margaret Atwood has she has a different. She doesn't call it science fiction. She calls it speculative fiction. You know, and I think the reason for that is that it's a very good place to speculate. You know, if you want to experiment with ideas, you know, science fiction is a form which really lends itself to that. And at its best, it's exploring ideas. You know, and at its worst, it's kind of space opera. You know, and sometimes, I mean, you know, Star Wars is space opera, but it's very good space opera. You know, but I like that kind of science fiction or fantasy, which is exploring some idea about which can very well be an idea about the present day, you know, but you can explore it on Mars,
Right.
1,000 years from now.
As a tangent real quick, what's the best science fiction that you've read as a book, not as a science fiction?
Oh,
What crosses over?
well, I would say there's a lot of Kurt Vonnegut. I'd say, Cat's Cradle.
Do you think of that as science fiction?
Well, the good one, the Cat's Cradle is science fiction. I mean, it's about this thing called Ice 9, that if you put it in water, it freezes. And so it becomes the ultimate weapon, because if it goes into the ocean, it freezes all the water in the world, and it's the end of the world. And so the whole novel is about whether the Ice 9 will get into the sea. And so yeah, that's science fiction. The Sirens of Titan is science fiction. That's very good. Slaughterhouse-Five is half science fiction. But actually the science fiction part of it, I think, is very good. All the kind of Planet Chalfamador stuff. So Vonnegut, I would say. I mean, Fahrenheit 451 is a brilliant idea, but it's not that wonderfully well written. It's a little plodding as a text, but it has this great idea in it. And I mean, that's what I mean. It's this idea that people have to memorize books in order to save books. It's so that people actually become books. Is a wonderful idea. No, and I mean, I think if I had to choose one thing, there's a short story by Arthur C. Clarke called The 9 Billion Names of God, which is about a Buddhist monastery in the mountains in the Himalayas, which buys the biggest supercomputer in the world. And these scientists, these computer engineers have to go to install it. And they can't imagine why these little monks up a mountain want this huge thing. And so they ask them while they're saying, and they say, well, you see, the purpose of our monastery is to enumerate the 9 billion names of God. And the computer will just help. We'll do it much faster. We can do it in like a week. And the computer engineers think, well, but then what will you do? Because then in a way you'll have destroyed the purpose of your monastery, and so they get worried about it. And the monks say, no, what you don't understand is it's not the purpose of our monastery to do this, it's the purpose of the universe to do this. And so when it has been done, the universe will end. It will not have any further reason for existing. And anyway, so the computer engineers build the computer, and they think, we should probably get away from here quickly, because when they do this and the universe doesn't end, they're going to be seriously disappointed. So they head back, and anyway, so they're on a plane going home at night, and they work out that this must be about the time when the computer has finished counting, and there they are flying in a plane through the sky going back to America. And they look out of the window and they see that one by one the stars are going out. It's an amazing 10-page story, but absolutely brilliant. So tell them to read that.
Okay. Well, wait, what's the title?
It's called The 9 Billion Names of God by Arthur C. Clarke, who also wrote the 2001 story. Yeah, no, I don't write. I do a lot of note taking in notebooks, but I also do it on my phone. I also do it on the computer. I just take notes whenever I need to, in whatever form. I don't write longhand because I discovered quite early that I couldn't tell in my own handwriting. I couldn't tell if it was any good or not. Somehow my handwriting got in the way, and sometimes I thought it was better than it was, and sometimes I thought it was worse than it was, but I could not be objective about it. And the moment it was in some typewriting, in the days of the typewriter, I could look at it and see what it needed better. So no, I never wrote longhand, but I used to type and then scribble all over it and then retype it. So and I still do that. I print out and scribble on the text and then put those changes into the computer and so on. But I got a computer in the early 90s, I suppose. The first novel I wrote on a computer was The Moore's Last Sigh, which came out in 95. And I was, like everything, I was kind of scared that it would somehow affect the way what you wrote. And I think it just doesn't really. I think what happens is like when you buy a new pen, there's a moment when the pen isn't doing what you want, and then after a minute it just becomes your pen, and that's it. And I think it's the same thing with a computer. I think. In fact, what I now find is because it's so much easier to make changes, you work on the text more. You actually work many more times on the text than when you have to annoyingly retype all the time. So I did make that shift from a typewriter to a computer, but never handwriting. In terms of process, it has changed actually. When I was starting out, when I was younger, I used to write much more in a day than I do now. But it was much more imperfect, and needed a lot of going over. Whereas now I don't write that much in a day, but it's much closer to a finished text. So I've lost a lot of speed, but I've gained, I think, a certain amount of control. And this feels better. Also, it used to be that I used to need a lot of very detailed architecture, before I could start writing. For example, Midnight's Children is a novel in which the characters' actions are so closely linked to historical events that you actually really need a map. You need to make sure everything fits with everything else. And now I find I obviously do have some architecture, I do have some sense of where the book is going, but I'm much more willing to let it happen on the page, to use a technique of more, something, it's not exactly improvisation, but a sort of technique closer to improvisation, to just see what happens that day. And it can be a wasteful way of writing, because sometimes what happens the next day you don't like it, and you have to think about something else. But I do that more than I used to, yeah. And the last couple of books certainly have emerged. Many of the important things in the books just happened on the page, and often required rewriting of earlier parts. That happens anyway. I remember the scene with which the Satanic Verses begins, which is these two people falling from the sky. When I wrote it, I had already written about 250 pages. Then I wrote this, and I remember thinking, what's this doing here? And didn't know quite what to do with it. And then it occurred to me that it actually would make a good beginning. And so then I thought, let's see what happens if I put it at the beginning. And then I thought that was good, and then I had to sort of really reshape all those 250 pages because of having had that idea much later. So that happens. But as I say, now I'm a bit freer, with the form than I used to be. There's no such thing as a perfect text. Sometimes that happens, but I think what happens is you just run out of creative energy for a particular story, and you realize that you're not really making things better you're just pushing them around, just making them different, and that's sort of what I call finishing. When I feel that I haven't really got in me the ability to make it any better, and then I become very interested in first readings, because sometimes those can tell you things. And again, that's something that's changed. I used to be much less tolerant of editorial advice. I would say, whose name is it on the book? Your name? No, my name. and now I think I'll use all the help I can get. So, and I mean, in all kinds of, for example, now that I've now been living in America for whatever it is, 19 years, I'm still, and I mean, I think I have a reasonable ear and so on, but I still want American readers to tell me if I've put something down which is not what would be said, and that's still, sometimes I make those mistakes. I mean, talking of Zadie, I mean, when I was reading, was it On Beauty, there are American characters who say to each other, "Give me a ring sometime." Yeah. And I think they're not asking to get married, I mean, and they would not say that, And I think that's the point of where Englishism has got past all the readers. So yeah, I mean, I asked, for example, when Grant asked me to sign The Enchantress of Florence, one of the difficulties in that book is that it happens at two places and two different moments in time. So so some of it is in India in the 16th century, and some of it is in Florence later. So there's a time difference as well as a difference of place, and the book has to move back and forth like that. And I worried a lot that readers would find that annoying, that they would be reading about one thing and suddenly we have to go halfway across the world. Why are we doing that? And so I asked some of the early readers of the book to tell me if they found it irritating, the jumping back and forth, and if so, where and when exactly that they found it irritating. And as a result of those readings, what happened is that I ended up doing the jumping back and forth much less. I revised the book into much longer segments, of in each place, so that people had the sense of being told something like a full story in each place, rather than the sense of being interrupted all the time, So in that sense, yes, other people's advice can be helpful, but I can only ask for that when I've taken it as far as I think I can take it, and then so it's that has changed, and also that's another difference in my writing than it used to be.
Have you been working with the same editor for a long time?
No, because publishing is like musical chairs. I've been published at Random House for a very long time, but the editors keep changing. And it's also partly because when I was living in England, I had an editor there, and now in New York, I don't want to work with the editor in England. I want to have somebody that I can actually sit in the same room as, and talk to. So it does change, but I mean, yeah, I'm lucky in having good editors. Yeah. Well, first of all, it has to start with India's too big. You know what I mean? I can't talk about India. It's India's colossal. I mean, I grew up in Bombay, which you'll find a lot of people in Bombay still don't call it Mumbai. In the way that people in Saigon don't call it Ho Chi Minh City.
I lived in Chennai, and lots of people
still call it Madras. And it's because these are kind of fake names. There never was a place called Chennai. So anyway, I grew up in Bombay, and I grew up in Bombay at a very interesting time in its history. First of all, this was my generation, was the first post-independence generation, the first generation that's growing up in a non-colonized country for more than 200 years, and yet, of course, that first generation is a transitional generation, because the influence of the empire doesn't disappear on Independence Day, and so there was that. I was growing up in still a very anglicized environment in some ways. But Bombay is the great city of India because it's by far the most cosmopolitan and international, and also because every kind of Indian person is there. You know, if you basically everything north of Bombay is North India, everything south of Bombay is South India. You know, so whereas in Delhi the population is almost entirely North Indian, in Calcutta the population is almost entirely Bengali, and in Madras it's almost entirely Tamil, or very very huge majorities. In Bombay you have everyone, because it's the big industrial city as well. It's a magnet, and people come from all over the country. And also because it's the great west-facing seaport, it's also the place in India where you have most non-Indian people. You know, so you have, you know, Americans and Europeans and Japanese people and so on, as well as Indians from everywhere. So it's really, there is no other city in India of which that's true. You know, and so to grow up there is already to grow up in a very multicultural place, you know, and I think that shaped the kind of writing that I did, like long before I ever came to the West. And Pakistan is, I mean, because I came from a Muslim family, although some of my family were very religious and others not religious, and my own bit of it was not religious. But because of the partition, like many Muslim families, my family was divided right down the middle, like more or less 50-50 on each side. And in a way that was an advantage to me, because growing up, we would sometimes go, I mean, we were living in India, but we would go to Pakistan to visit uncles and aunts and so on. And so I got to know Pakistan, or bits of it, Karachi and Rawalpindi in particular, I got to know quite well. And as time has passed, there is much less of that back and forth. You know, so people of my generation could still know both countries. You know, and now that's really not true. Now Pakistanis tend to have a series of stereotypical images of Indians, and Indians tend to have a series of equally stereotypical images of Pakistanis, and very few people have that ability to bridge that frontier. And I think one of the things I'm happy about is that my books, because they do straddle the frontier, in a way help in South Asia, help to explain each country to the other one. You know, so Pakistani readers of Midnight Children find out something about what India was like at that time, and vice versa. You know, so they have become very, very, you know, obviously hostile to each other, and alienated from each other. And then they used to be exactly like each other. That's the thing. I mean, that because that border has only existed for 70 years in a multiple thousand-year history. You know, so, and you know, Bombay and Karachi are really very close. I mean, they're, you know, as the crow flies, they're not even 200 miles apart. You know, and the same is true of Lahore and Amritsar, you know, which are on opposite sides of the frontier. And you know, it was the same culture, really, and now it's not. I mean, now they're very, very, very different.
I don't want to bore the book people with Indian and Pakistan stuff, but it's so true. I mean, even in the 80s or in the 90s when I was there, people still remembered being in Lahore and being in Amritsar and going to movies in Lahore.
Exactly.
I remember a Pakistani general who could recall the day up in Dehradun in the officers' school when a British officer got up and said, "Right, all the officer candidates for Pakistan on this side of the room, all the officer candidates."
Yes. Well, that was a crazy, and the craziness of partition. There's a brilliant short story by the writer Saadat Hasan Manto, a story called Toba Tek Singh, which is the name of an imaginary place. And it's a story that takes place in a lunatic asylum that's in the area of where the partition is going, the border is going to come, but nobody at that point is certain whether the border will pass to the east or the west, so whether the lunatic asylum will end up being in India or Pakistan. And so the people in the lunatic asylum have to decide whether the Pakistani lunatics will be sent to west to Pakistan, or whether the Indian lunatics will have to be sent east. So there's this great uncertainty and everybody's mad, you know, which doesn't help. as a sort of little miniature metaphor of the insanity of that event, to set it in a lunatic asylum is just, it's very, very funny and very, very painful. And again, it's 10 pages long. Strongly recommended. But yeah, I mean, I think all of us, the independence of India was on the one hand joyful, and on the other hand bloody. And the numbers of people who died in the partition massacres, I think nobody knows. But I mean, the official figures say 400,000 or 500,000, but it's probably at least twice that. So they have a country born in blood. And it's 2 countries, now 3 countries because of the split in Pakistan. And Bangladesh, yes, which had its own bloody birth because of the War of Independence there. So you've got, on the one hand, this kind of triumphant moment of the expulsion of the colonialists, and on the other hand, this horror, and the 2 things happening at the same time, and not being able to think about one without the other, and that certainly for people of my parents' generation and my generation, that's the defining thing. And yeah, I mean, I think that's where Midnight Children came from. It came from trying to get to grips with all of that. Well, I mean, what's interesting about magic realism, Latin American magic realism, is that, when people use the phrase, they tend to only hear the word magic and not to hear the word realism. Because actually a lot of that, a lot of 100 Years of Solitude is rooted in history, and certainly Garcia Marquez was very committed to the idea of being a good journalist, and his books come out of that too. No, I mean, I think one of the things that happens in a time of contested reality, or contested truth, is that the act of remembering can become politicized if the powers that be have a different version that they want to impose upon you. So again, I mean, in Milan Kundera's novel, The Book of Laughter and Forgetting, he says that. He says the struggle of man against power is the struggle of memory against forgetting, and it's one of the things that has happened a few times in my writing life, that I've just been wanting to write about something that I remember, like the genocide carried out by the Pakistan army at the end of the Bangladesh war, carried out in Bangladesh. But then you find that event is completely denied by successive Pakistani governments, some of them military, some of them civilian, denied for like 30 years, until finally they begin to admit that something happened. And you find that all you're doing is writing about something you remember, and that you want to get down on paper, and you find yourself put into a position of political contention because the official truth is not that, and I think we find ourselves in that in many, many parts of the world now. Writers find themselves contesting official truth, because as we see everywhere, and not least in the United States, official truth has some problems to it these days. So, and it's very hard because I don't like novels that are didactic. I don't like to be preached at in a book. So it's very hard to know how in fiction you're going to take on this stuff. So it may be easier to do it outside fiction, in a more direct kind of writing. But I think what you can do in fiction is to create portraits of a world which conform to one's idea of the real truth, rather than the official. And maybe that's something that has to happen again, even in America. Yeah, no, my son, Harun is my older son's middle name. And then he, actually, when I was writing the Satanic Verses, he was a little boy, you know, he was like 8 or so. He said, why don't you write books I'd like to read? And I thought, you know, good question. and so I said to him, well, let me just finish this one I'm writing now, and then I'll try and write one that maybe you would like to read. And so I did. This was the first book I wrote after the Satanic Verses, and actually he was very helpful as a first reader, because obviously I wanted to make sure that he liked it, you know. So when I'd written, I can't remember how many, 30 or 40 pages, you know, I asked him to read it, and he did. And I said, what do you think? And he said, yeah, Dad, it's good. and I felt that I heard a certain lack of enthusiasm, you know. So I said, you think you like it? And he said, yeah, Dad, I like it. He said, you know, some people might be bored. I said, what do you mean? What do you mean some people might be bored? And why? And he said, no, not me, of course, Dad, I'd read it. but some people. And I said, why would they be bored? And he said, he used this wonderful word. He said, it doesn't have enough jump in it. Jump. And you know, it's one of those things that I knew exactly what he meant, because it was very clear. And I thought, I could do jump. I'll give me that back. So I went away and rewrote it and showed it to him again, and he said, yeah, no, it's fine. You know, so it was actually maybe the most constructive criticism I ever received, because it was so clear, you know, and it told me exactly what to do. And so, yeah, it was written in the first place to please one person. But even then, I think there are two other questions that I was asking myself. One is, okay, so that's about him, but it also has to be pleasing to me. And you know, what is it? How can I make it pleasing to me? And the way I came to think of it is that the book was like a message in a bottle. You know, that it was written for him at the age of 11, you know, but it was also written for him as a grown-up. And that if he read it at the age of 11, he would get, I hoped, kind of 11-year-old pleasure from it, you know. And then if he were to read it again as an adult, he would, in a way, in effect, read a different book, you know. And that seems to have worked, you know. I mean, in the sense that it's a book which pleases adults and children, you know. And I thought there's no reason why that shouldn't be possible, because, for example, in the movies, it happens all the time. You know, that there are films where you don't ask yourself whether this is for grown-ups or for children. You know, if you're going to see Star Wars or, you know, Black Panther or, you know, Who Framed Roger Rabbit or etc. It's unimportant to ask that question. You know, they somehow manage to be for everyone. You know, and I thought, well, there must be a sort of literary equivalent of that. You know, and so that was the hard thing about writing the book, was exactly where to pitch it, you know. And when I was first starting to write it, I would think, no, it's too childish. And then I'd try it again, and I would think, no, it's too grown up. And just trying to find exactly what that note was, you know, to hit that would allow it to cross those frontiers, you know. And I mean, in the end, I finished it, and I thought that's as well as I can do it. But it's been very. I mean, the reaction to that book has been one of the most pleasurable things in my life as a writer, you know, because people have loved it as children have grown up and have read it to their children, and that feels lovely. You know, it feels really wonderful. And then you know, because I have another son who's much younger than that one, 18 years younger. Then he grew up, and he said, "Where's my book?" and so I had to write another one. So you know, Luca and the Fire of Life, which came out almost 20 years after that, is written in exactly the same way. Again, please one specific reader, and then hopefully more beyond that, you know. But yeah, I mean, I understand why people who write children's books seem so happy all the time, you know, because you get the most wonderful reader's response, you know. I mean, I get these things from, like, whole classes will have read Haroun, and they will send me drawings of the characters, and they'll tell me which bits they liked and which bits they didn't like, and they'll send me notes for sequels, things like. I mean, it's great, you know, to get that, and you don't get that from grown-up books, you know. So,
To write any more for?
well, I've done 2, and I only have 2 children, but you know, I'm sort of a believer in the rule of 3. I think if there's 2 of something, there should be 3 of it. And I also think that they're both about boys, you know, and it would be nice to do one which had a girl protagonist.
I've got a daughter you could write one.
Okay. Well, I have.
Also a real young age range. She's 1 now.
Well, I have nieces, but they're older now. But maybe I can reimagine their childhood, you know. I mean, I've always thought, you know, when Lewis Carroll wrote the 2 Alice books, the first one is easy because the girl's right there, you know, not say easy, it's not easy, but there's a very particular person who is right in front of him that he can model the character on. By the time he gets around to writing Through the Looking Glass, first of all, he's not really in touch with the family anymore, and secondly, she's many years older. She's not that little girl anymore, you know, and so he has to write the second book out of the memory of childhood, rather than the presence of childhood, you know, and it makes me sometimes made me feel that the second book is more impressive because of that, because it's a harder mountain to climb, you know, and also it had the problem of being the successor to Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, which already had become, you know, a colossal success almost immediately, and has of course there's the follow that problem, and which he I think managed to do very well. So I think maybe that the kind of memory of childhood can be an inspiration as well as the presence of the child, you know. Yeah, I mean, I would hope that before I'm done, I can write a 3rd one. Yeah, I like that. Yeah, no, I mean, I think, you know, I was so happy that I finally found a way to let all that in to a book, because I've been, I think, in my life, as deeply influenced by film as by books, you know, 100%. I mean, sometimes I think more influenced by films, you know, and it's partly because, or not partly, partly it's because growing up in Bombay, you're in the middle of the world's biggest movie city, you know, and there's no way of not being obsessed with films if that's where you grow up. And then when I was at college in England, it was this extraordinary moment in the history of the sound cinema. You know, there's this, I mean, I was at Cambridge in the mid-60s, 65 to 8. But this period from the late 1950s to the early 1970s, you know, is this period which now is, I think, more or less universally seen as the golden age of the sound cinema, you know, and it's very difficult to make people understand what it was like when these films, which we now think of as classics, were this week's new movie. You know, and you went to the movie theater and there was this film called 8½. You know, and the next week there would be, you know, a film called Jules Jim, and the next week a film called Alphaville, and the next week a film called, you know, L'Aventura, and then, you know, The Seventh Seal, and you know, The Exterminating Angel, and so on. I mean, this extraordinary burst of world cinema that happened there. I mean, I think there was this tiny movie theater in Cambridge, so a little art house theater.
Still there,
No, it's not. No, it's a coffee
nice.
shop now.
Yeah.
It's like everything else. It's a coffee shop. But it used to be this little alley off the Market Square where there was this art house theater called the Art Cinema, and I would go several times a week, you know, and see all these extraordinary films. And I mean, there weren't, actually wasn't very, it was one of these moments when American cinema was not the dominant thing, you know, that there was the French New Wave and the Italian New Wave, and there were all these other, you know, like Buñuel in Spain and Bergman in Sweden, and, you know, Satyajit Ray in India, and Kurosawa in Japan, and, you know, all of that happening at the same time. And there were a few American filmmakers who were up there in that, you know, there was like Robert Altman and, you know, and Arthur Penn, and, you know, one or two others. But it really was world cinema at that time. And so, yeah, it was just a great love of mine. And I finally was able to give all that lifetime of film nerd stuff to and actually, the truth is, if I was to be completely not realistic about it, a young man like Rene in New York City now, even people coming out of NYU Film School, they don't know that stuff. They think an old movie is 20 years old. And to take them back to something that came out in 1958, you know, etc. Anyway, so I allowed him to have that old knowledge, just because I wanted to write about those films, you know. And the book was helped by, I mean, as you can see fairly obviously, one of the films that is behind the book is Rear Window, you know, and I mean, Hitchcock is one of those people who was right there, you know, very ahead of his time, brilliant filmmaker, you know.
So Hitchcock always had a vignette appearance in his films. Did you appear in both?
No. I mean, and Hitchcock used to. He said he used to try and do it early in the film to get it over with, because he didn't want people to be watching the whole movie looking for Alfred Hitchcock, because it would distract them from the actual movie. But no, I have not made a guest appearance in it. No. But it's just that the films, and actually once I had this idea that the narrator was a young would-wannabe filmmaker, you know, it opened up a lot of things in the book, including in the way the book was written. It allowed me to write parts of it sort of cinematically, you know, and the book kind of slides in and out of screenplay at one or two points, and even beyond that is constructed quite often in visual scenes, you know, and that was nice. That was fun to do, because I haven't done that before quite.
Could it be adapted?
I hope so.
Yeah.
I mean, but you know, these days, it's television more than film nowadays. You know, where you find interest in doing serious drama. You know, and the movies, unfortunately, are. You know, it's easier to get $200 million to make a superhero movie than to get $10 million to make a serious drama. You know, that's the strange world of Hollywood. But compensating for that is this explosion of good television. You know, and I think that's where the interest is right now. I can tell you that I just signed a deal with Netflix, who want to do a multi-season adaptation of Midnight's Children. And I mean, we just literally, the ink's not even dry on the contract, so we've got to start work on it. I'm not going to write it. I said the only thing I'm going to do is not write it. So we have the first thing. I mean, they're in the process of trying to put together a short list of possible lead writers, and I mean, I'll be involved, but I'm just not going to write it. I've spent too much time on that book as it is. So.
How involved do you want to be in the?
Oh well, I mean, I'll be exec producer, you know. So I mean, it means that I'll keep my finger on it. But actually, I'd sooner people did things that I couldn't think of, you know, because you know, Midnight Children is a very young man's book. You know, when I started writing it, I was 28 years old. You know, when it came out, I was 33 years old. You know, and you know, now I'm about to be 71. So it needs to have that youthfulness about it. You know, and I would like there to be some great young kid, you know, to come and write it with that kind of vigor. you know. Yeah. So anyway, that's happening. So hopefully now that that's happening, maybe one or two of the others will follow suit. No? Certainly, I mean, I think the good thing about TV now is that there are so many people looking for material that it's easier for writers of literary fiction to find somebody who wants to do it. You know, so I mean, in the case of Netflix, one of the reasons I think they want to do it is that they're hoping to make a big drive into India, and they're trying to find projects to spearhead that. They've already, there's I don't know if the novel that you have here, the Indian-American writer Vikram Chandra, his novel Sacred Games, which is like 1,000-page novel. It's like The Godfather of India. I mean, it's a gangster novel, in which the two main characters are a kind of godfather figure and a police officer who's pursuing him. And I mean, it's a very good gangster novel, and they've already made, I think, you've shot season 1 of that, and that's going to come out soon. And now they want to do this, and I think they're trying to find projects which speak to an Indian audience. I mean, they're not with Midnight Children. It's certainly not going to be only for India. It's going to be globally, but they think it'll help them.
Will there be dancing?
Will there be dancing? I can't answer that question. I think we're not. I can say I hope not. Except there's at least one character in the book who's a dancer, so maybe she'll get to dance.
When I lived in India, we had a friend who was a filmmaker, and he made a very serious film, and his producers made him put at least one dance.
Yeah. Well, now you have. I mean, in the classic Bollywood formula, you have to put 6. And then very often those 6 song and dance sequences get taken out of the film and get used as music videos, you know, to launch the whatever song it is. You know, so, but yeah, no, I think no singing, no dancing.
Well, I think our time is up. I think we could talk for 5 more hours. But,
Thank you.
we
Well,
have
this
a
was
cocktail
fun.
to go to. So
Yeah.
thank you so much.
Thank you.
Really
Thank you.